Sticking with Dr. Gates for another minute. So what is the forecast for the 2010 census, and are there any improvements in data gathering for the LGBT community that you're aware of on the horizon?
Well, I mean, there's an interesting, I don't know how many of you are aware of the current controversy. There was a story in the San Jose Mercury News a couple weeks ago, which quoted me, that talked about the fact that census will not be counting same-sex married couples. So if, right now, if I have another male in my house and I call him my husband, census automatically changes him from a husband to an unmarried partner. And their argument in 2000 was, one, that just in terms of accuracy, that legally can't be your husband. So, and further, that the Defense of Marriage Act prohibits the Bureau from actually counting same-sex married couples. And just so you know, that was actually an improvement. In 1990, they would have changed him to a woman. So, so the Bureau actually, and honestly, like this really was them understanding that, well, in fact, it might not be so odd that someone would consider a same-sex person their spouse, whereas in 1990, they just said, that's ridiculous. They must have checked the wrong sex. So, but anyway, the problem now is that the conditions have changed, and what this is forcing the census to do is to change a potentially accurate response to an inaccurate response. And so I had an op-ed in the LA Times. It wound up getting picked up on the AP and the Washington Post, and it was in the New York Times. So all that by way of saying it got the attention of the Bureau. And so we're now in discussions with them of how to do this. My sense is that there will I think two things will happen in 2010. There's not going to be a change in the question. They're not going to ask sexual orientation. There are actually, there's political issues with that, but there are also kind of methodological issues around the census trying to ask sexual orientation, because census is a household survey, and it's only one person in the household giving the information for everyone else. So you're asking dad to give the sexual orientation of his 19-year-old son. And it's not clear how you do that and how you do it in a way that you get really accurate data. So I'll give them a pass on that issue. But for the same-sex couples, my hope is that at the very least, they'll release data that we can back out how many say they're married. And I think we've gotten them to consider, right now, the only information about same-sex couples that the census publicly releases is how many there are. That's the only, if you go on what's called American Fact Finder, which is their big web interface, the only thing you can find out about same-sex couples is how many of them there are. I'm pushing pretty hard to say you need to do cross-tabulations with socioeconomic data, with race and ethnicity, child rearing, that kind of thing, so that people have broader access. Now, in doing that, I'm kind of taking my own niche away, because I'm the one that can do that with their data. But I think it would be an enormous value for people to be able to see that on the website. And just finally to say, one of the issues with this, though, is that even in Census 2000, by my estimate, which is, I have a really backdoor way to get at it, it looks like perhaps as many as 30% of same-sex couples use the term spouse. Clearly, there's not that many same-sex couples who are legally married in the United States. So it's a social construction for the vast majority more than it is a legal construction. And Census's legitimate concern is we can't, we're all about accuracy, and where heterosexuals is concerned, this is a more or less accurate count of legally married couples. For same-sex couples, this is a mixture now of legally married couples and sort of socially constructed married couples. And they need to figure out a way that they can say that so that people understand that this is not necessarily a count of how many people who have legally married. So that's sort of what the hot issue right now is.
Thank you. And of course, we're talking about the numbers, but we're really trying to get to the implications of the numbers. Dr. McFarland, in your experience, how do numbers tell a story, and how do they impact public policy and health decisions?
Well, from a perspective of HIV prevention and care planning, these numbers mean everything to us. We really can't understand the HIV epidemic and the appropriate response to without these numbers. These numbers are the denominators for understanding when we say HIV prevalence, what does that translate to in numbers of people? For instance, the question might arise, does 20% HIV infection rate in MSM translate to more people living with HIV than, say, 2% among heterosexual women? So radically different resource allocation, first pass, radically different resource allocation is implied by those figures, by the denominators, and radically different programs that need funding to address the epidemic. So it's hard to overstate how this number drives almost all our decisions about how we plan for prevention and care in the city. It stems from the fact that 90% of our epidemic in San Francisco is among LGBT, particularly gay and bisexual men and transgendered persons. I mean, I can give you an example. That actually is a concrete example. In the mid-1990s, there was a sentiment that the HIV epidemic among MSM had been dealt with adequately, that it was shifting towards the heterosexual population, the general population. And to some extent in the world, this was true. It just wasn't true in San Francisco. But nonetheless, the prevention budget for the city had the largest allocation towards heterosexuals. And it wasn't until we really could get better, convincing, credible numbers of how many LGBT there were in the city that it could be correctly realigned to where the epidemic was for that very reason. So those are very concrete examples of where decisions are made that really affect the funding of millions of programs of prevention and care.
Thank you. And so you're talking about sexual behavior, and the other two speakers are talking about LGBT identity. And so it is, I guess, impressive that the numbers do match up. And I'm not sure who to throw this question out to, but could you address sexual behavior versus LGBT identity?
I mean, I'll take one start at that, just to say that obviously there's actually 3 different ways, and if you count census, 4 different ways that people try to enumerate gay people in some fashion. Identity. So do you call yourself, do you see yourself as, do you think of yourself as, heterosexual, gay, homosexual, bisexual, a behavior question, and so that question has challenges because to a large degree heterosexuals don't call themselves anything. If you actually wanted the question that would get the best response, you should ask, one of the response categories should be normal. Because if you do the focus groups, which marketers do all the time to try to figure out how best to ask questions to get the kind of information they want, when you ask people that in those settings, people say, well, I'm just normal. And they don't know what a lot of them don't know what the word heterosexual means, they don't know what the word straight means, because they don't have to call themselves anything, they're the majority. So that has some challenges, although largely most surveys have now shown that it's a pretty good question and people broadly know what it is. And we get, again, we look at lots of surveys and like nationally, we get pretty consistent numbers. It's in the neighborhood of 4%, 3 to 4 to 5% when we use identity. So that increases our confidence that that question is working because we just keep getting the same responses. Then behavior, and the issue with behavior is, well, what behaviors and since when? So is it since you've been age 18? Is it in the last year, the last 5 years? What behaviors are we talking about? Do we define them explicitly? So in the National Survey of Family Growth, they asked men, have you ever had anal or oral sex with another man? And in that behavior question, they got about 5.7%, I think it was. When they asked women a different question, which was, have you ever had sexual contact with women? They got 11%. Completely different and obviously a very different question. What did they mean by sexual contact? So that question, presents challenges. One of the least studied is this idea of attraction. So how do you measure people's desire or people's attraction and what do you ask? And there are certainly studies that do that. And it would be lovely if the way the data always worked was that there's 3 circles. You have this big circle of attraction, and then you have a smaller circle inside that's behavior, and then inside that you have identity. But in truth, it's a Venn diagram. It's 3 different circles, and you have people in those categories who are not in the other one. So you actually have men who identify as gay but don't have sex with other men. And certainly you have a lot of the reverse. And it's actually even more complicated for women. So